The first thing that struck Lord Peter Wimsey upon his casual arrival at the village of Little Harrowby was not the purportedly tragic circumstance that had drawn him there, though that, of course, was the ostensible reason for his presence, but the sheer unlikelihood of the telegram that had summoned him. It read, in clipped and urgent capitals, that a tragedy of the most peculiar sort has occurred at Renfield Manor. Immediate assistance requested. Wimsey, a man accustomed to a certain dramatic tone in telegrams, frowned delicately over the rim of his pince-nez. "Immediate assistance," he murmured, rather grandiose for what is almost certainly a broken teacup or a missing cat. He folded the note with painstaking precision, a small gesture that communicated both skepticism and irritation at the careless excess of urgency. Renfield Manor itself rose against the November fog like a bewigged old pier, its chimneys curling smoke like the plume of a battle standard. The gravel crunched beneath Wimsey's shoes as he paused on the drive, inspecting the double gates with a sort of ironic curiosity. A very impressive approach for what, I suspect, will turn out to be an utterly mundane domestic complication, he murmured to himself, glancing at the urns of frost-hardened chrysanthemums. He was met at the door by Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper, a woman whose tight bun seemed to be an extension of her personality, unyielding, exacting, and judgmental. She regarded him with suspicion, as though the mere presence of a gentleman, especially one bearing a slight smile and a walking stick with concealed steel, was a subtle insult to the household. "Lord Peter Wimsey, I presume," she said, in a tone that suggested she might have expected the ghost of Hamlet rather than a living detective. Well, something dreadful has occurred in the East Wing. Upstairs." Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly, and for a moment Wimsey wondered if the trembling was the result of shock or merely the exertion of holding a folded napkin with military precision. "Good heavens, Mrs. Weatherby," he said, offering her the faintest arch of a smile. "Pray do not exaggerate. One of my personal hobbies is the detection of false horrors. It is extraordinary how many so-called tragedies turn out to be nothing more than mislaid keys or an unfortunate cat trapped in a pantry." Mrs. Weatherby did not smile. "No, my lord. I'm afraid this is real." She led him up the narrow staircase, and Wimsey noted, without drawing attention to the fact, that the newel post had a curious scratch near the base, as if someone had clumsily dragged a small piece of furniture, or perhaps an even smaller body, against it. The door at the end of the corridor opened with a slow creak. Within, under the dim glow of a single gas lamp, lay the figure of a young bride, Miss Evangeline Merton, sprawled across the floor in a white silk gown whose veil was torn and powdered with dust. A single glimmering ring had slipped from her finger, rolling silently across the parquet. Wimsey bent to examine the ring, noting the peculiar way it had come to rest on its edge, as if it had been dropped with care rather than lost in struggle. "Ah," he murmured. "Curious. One would think a bride on the floor would clutch her rings, or at the very least cry out. And yet, here we are. Silence and a solitary ring." He glanced up at Mrs. Weatherby, who was trembling now with something between fear and indignation. "And you say this occurred while the house was otherwise empty?" "Yes, my lord. Only the servants, and we were all in the kitchen." Wimsey allowed a faint, wry smile to flicker. "Well then, my dear Mrs. Weatherby, either we have a most extraordinarily stealthy intruder, or our young lady has been practicing some rather theatrical fainting." He crouched beside Miss Merton, careful not to disturb the exact arrangement of her limbs, a meticulousness born from habit, and one that would later prove invaluable. "Lord Peter," Mrs. Weatherby whispered, She is breathing." "Ah," Wimsey said softly, straightening. "Well, that is, of course, the first small mercy. The next will be discovering why anyone in their right mind would stage such a scene, or perhaps why the scene has staged itself." He paused, observing the faintly oppressive shadows cast by the single lamp, the slight skew of the floorboards, and the inexplicable chill that seemed to radiate from the far corner of the room. Little Harrowby, I fear, is about to become more entertaining than I anticipated, or perhaps more tragic. In either case, one must maintain a proper sense of decorum and curiosity. And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey, the archest of gentlemen and the most perspicacious of observers, began his silent, inward tally of every minor irregularity. The dust pattern on the mantel, the angle of the shattered veil, the faint imprint of a heel on the polished floor. Each triviality would, in due course, prove to be far more significant than anyone, including the poor, fainting bride herself, could imagine. For the first time that evening, the house seemed to hold its breath. And Wimsey, arch, amused, and ever so slightly impatient, smiled at the delicious promise of a puzzle. Wimsey allowed Mrs. Weatherby to settle Miss Merton on a nearby settee, noting as he did so the subtle stiffness in the girl's fingers and the faint pallor creeping beneath her powdered cheeks. He crouched briefly, inspecting the scuff marks on the floor and the precise angle at which the veil had torn. Then he rose with that habitual tilt of the head, a gesture that suggested both impatience and curiosity, and surveyed the room with the air of a man stepping into a carefully arranged stage. "Now, my dear Mrs. Weatherby," he said with a touch of theatrical gravity, "we must reconstruct the precise chronology. Please be candid. Nothing is trivial. Every shadow, every door left ajar, every footstep may prove decisive." The housekeeper straightened, smoothing her apron as though it were armor against the discomforting thought that someone might be listening too closely. It was shortly after tea, my lord. We had just cleared the dining room. Miss Merton insisted on taking a turn in the east wing, as she likes the view of the gardens. She hesitated, glancing toward the closed door as though to warn herself against disclosing too much. The corridor was empty. I had sent the other maid to fetch the candles, and the cook and I were attending to the tea service. Wimsey nodded slowly, noting the subtle twitch of her lips as she spoke. "Alone in the corridor, you say? And the east wing window?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened. "All closed, my lord, except the smallest one in the library, but it is a high window, locked from the inside. Miss Merton could not have reached it without assistance." "Indeed," Wimsey murmured, stepping closer to the fireplace and running his gloved fingers along the mantel, noting the faint smudge of dust disturbed in a narrow arc. "And yet the veil is torn, the ring displaced. One might almost suspect an encounter." He allowed the question to hang, deliberately non-committal while carefully scanning for other anomalies. The displaced candlestick, the faint imprint on the carpet, the slight indentation in the edge of the settee where Miss Merton had collapsed. Mrs. Weatherby's hands gripped the edge of the mantel. "I swear, my lord, there was no one. I heard nothing. Nothing at all." "Nothing, you say?" Wimsey repeated, his tone light but not unkind. "Curious, that. You will forgive me, but the floorboards here speak differently. Observe these indentations. They suggest, if one reads them correctly, that someone of small stature moved with considerable deliberation. Or perhaps there were two movements, not one, overlapping in a rather unusual way." He knelt again, tracing a faint heel mark with a gloved fingertip. "And here, the scuff of a second shoe, a slightly heavier tread. One might imagine a brief struggle, had it not been perfectly silent. Silence, I assure you, is a most deceptive companion." Mrs. Weatherby's lips parted, a faint shiver passing through her frame. I cannot imagine who—" "Precisely," Wimsey said, standing and gesturing toward the faintly dusty corridor. "It is often the simplest explanations that conceal the most ingenious deceptions. I shall need to speak with the other household staff individually. One is tempted to take their word for it, but one must never assume sincerity in matters of intrigue." He descended the staircase with the same deliberate grace that characterized all his movements, pausing occasionally to adjust a cuff or to inspect a curious scratch on a newel post. Servants shuffled nervously in the hallway, exchanging glances that were not entirely innocent. Whimsy's sharp eyes caught each subtle signal, the slight hesitation in a curtsy, the avoidance of direct gaze, the microsecond too long in answering a question. Each small deviation was catalogued meticulously in his mind, as if the house itself were a ledger of human frailty. The cook, a stout woman with a sharp tongue and a perpetually furrowed brow, proved the first to yield something of note. She insisted upon her innocence with an almost comical fervor, but, in recounting her movements, revealed a discrepancy in the timing of the tea service. A pot had been delivered a full 5 minutes earlier than Mrs. Weatherby's initial statement. A minor detail, but one that would soon take on greater significance. From the gardener, Whimsy learned of the slightly ajar back gate, a fact that seemed inconsequential until he noted the footprints in the mud outside. A single, small boot print, distinct and deliberate, heading neither entirely toward the manor nor entirely away. He made a mental note to compare it with the heel mark upstairs. By the time he had returned to the east wing, dusk had crept fully across the corridors, and the chill in the air had deepened. Miss Merton remained seated, wrapped in a shawl, still pale but recovering her composure. Whimsy's gaze rested upon her with detached calculation, yet not without empathy. He understood in that quiet way of his the terrible vulnerability of a mind confronted with inexplicable events. "Tell me," he said softly, "have you noticed anything, however trivial, that seemed odd before the incident? A sound, a shadow, an unusual draft?" She shook her head, but her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, a tiny, unconscious motion. Whimsy's eyes flicked to it, noting the slight abrasion on the silk, almost imperceptible, yet suggestive of contact with something sharp or deliberate. "Ah," he murmured, almost to himself. "Trivial indeed, yet entirely revealing. Little Harrowby, it seems, has begun its whispering, and we must listen closely to what it has to say." He rose and moved to the window, peering into the dimming gardens. The fog swirled in lazy eddies, curling around statues and trimmed hedges like spectral fingers. The east wing held its secrets tightly, yet each small anomaly, the scuffed floor, the displaced ring, the misplaced footprints, was a piece of a puzzle gradually revealing its outline. Whimsy's lips curved in that faint arch smile, half amusement, half anticipation. He had already begun to discern the shape of the game, and he knew that the next few hours would demand both patience and precision. And somewhere in the hush of the manor, between the closed doors and the thick shadows, the true story was waiting patiently, ready to be uncovered. By mid-evening, the household had settled into a tense, watchful quiet, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of a teacup or the distant barking of a hound in the fog-shrouded grounds. Whimsy, having catalogued the preliminary observations with meticulous care, had requested to see the other occupants of Renfield Manor, the few who were present that day. It was clear that beneath the veneer of calm civility there existed an undercurrent of anxiety, each individual straining to present themselves as blameless and composed. The first to be interviewed was Mr. Roland Fiennes, a distant cousin of the bride and, according to Mrs. Weatherby, the only visitor in residence apart from the household staff. He arrived in the drawing-room with a preoccupied air, as if the gravity of the incident were an inconvenience to his schedule. He was a tall, angular man with a thin mustache and a faintly sardonic expression, and he greeted Whimsy with a measured nod, as though evaluating whether the detective was to be tolerated or endured. "Lord Peter," he began, his voice smooth but slightly tense, "I can assure you I was in the library at the time Miss Merton had her episode. I heard nothing unusual, aside from the odd rustling of papers, naturally, but the wind rattles those shutters constantly." Whimsy inclined his head politely, yet with the faintest arch that suggested skepticism. "Indeed. And the library window, Mr. Fiennes? That is the one that was unlocked, albeit from the inside. Surely you must have noticed whether it was closed when you entered?" Roland Fienne hesitated, a shadow crossing his otherwise composed countenance. "I cannot say with certainty. It has been a long day." His hands fidgeted slightly with the cuff of his sleeve, a subtle gesture Whimsy did not miss. "Curious," Whimsy murmured, glancing around the room. "You were alone in a house in which a young bride has experienced a most peculiar accident. One might suppose, however, that every minor detail would be fresh in your mind." He allowed the remark to hang, phrased as polite observation, yet with the unmistakable weight of a question designed to probe inconsistencies. Roland Fienne's eyes flicked toward the fireplace, where a single candle guttered. I had no reason to attend to the East Wing, and I assure you, I observed no intruder. Nothing out of the ordinary." Whimsy tilted his head, noting the slight smudge on the polished floor near the library door. The mark was subtle, almost as if it had been made by dragging something lightly along the parquet. And yet the floor tells a slightly different story. One must remember, Mr. Fiennes, that surfaces tend to record what minds sometimes forget. The conversation was interrupted by the timid entrance of Miss Agnes Perry, the bride's governess and an elderly lady whose manners were impeccable and whose nerves were taut. She shuffled forward, clutching a reticule with such insistence that the joints of her fingers whitened. "My dear Lord Peter," she whispered, "it was dreadful, simply dreadful. I cannot imagine why." She broke off, glancing toward the hallway as though the very walls might bear witness to her distress. "You were nearby, I understand," Whimsy prompted gently, and yet heard nothing unusual. "Yes," she said, almost in a tremor, "though I must confess I was attending to the children in the nursery. But even so, there is something in the air, something I cannot explain. It is as though the house itself were whispering." Whimsy smiled faintly, a touch of dry irony in his eyes. "Indeed, whispering houses are far more common than one might imagine, Miss Perry. And yet what they whisper is rarely supernatural. More often, it is the reflection of human movement, the slight tremor of a hand, the subtle shift of a carpet, the quietest displacement of a ring." He allowed a pause, letting the statement settle before continuing. "We must attend to these details with patience and care, for they are the true witnesses, far more reliable than startled servants or distressed governesses." As the interviews continued, Whimsy's attention wandered to the seemingly trivial. The slight unevenness of the curtains in the East Wing, the misaligned clock in the drawing room, the faint scratch on the banister, the way a certain portrait seemed to tilt imperceptibly toward the fireplace. Each observation, he recognized, would eventually serve a purpose. By the time he returned to the corridor outside the East Wing, a faint draught stirred the edges of Miss Merton's veil, now folded neatly on a small chair. The ring had been replaced on a satin cushion, though its orientation, tilted imperceptibly, reminded him that it had not been merely dropped. It had been set down, perhaps by a hand that sought to appear gentle, yet had left subtle evidence of haste or nervousness. Whimsy's mind began to weave a tentative tapestry of events. The timeline was, so far, coherent but fragile. Every statement from the staff and guests offered a thread, and already he detected a small but telling anomaly in the accounts. A gap of several minutes, precisely the span during which the ring had shifted, the veil had torn, and the scuff marks had appeared. It was a window small enough to be overlooked by all, yet large enough for a deliberate action to occur. Stepping into the dim corridor, Whimsy allowed himself a faint, arch smile. The puzzle was forming, delicate and intricate, like the lace of a spider's web catching the last rays of twilight. Somewhere within the measured movements and carefully maintained appearances, the truth was concealed, and he knew, without doubt, that the next question he asked would draw the first thin threads of revelation. And in that quiet anticipation, the East Wing seemed to hold its breath, ready to surrender its secrets, one subtle clue at a time. The following morning, Renfield Manor presented a deceptively tranquil facade. Mist clung to the gardens like a shroud, and the distant cawing of rooks provided a somber accompaniment to the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Whimsy, who had spent the night in quiet reflection over the few details gathered, moved with his usual deliberate grace, inspecting each corridor and threshold as if the house itself were a living manuscript. It was during this inspection that Mr. Cecil Thornton, a solicitor known to the family and a frequent visitor to the manor, arrived unexpectedly. Thornton was a man of precise habits and unmistakable hauteur, whose sharp eyes missed nothing but whose tongue often raced ahead of his thoughts. He greeted Whimsy with a measured nod and, without preamble, began recounting his recent business with the bride's father. "Lord Peter," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of civility and underlying tension, "I trust you are aware that there are certain pecuniary matters concerning Miss Merton which may complicate these unfortunate events." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle, and added with a pointed glance at the scattered household, "It is, I confess, regrettable timing." Whimsy arched a single brow, permitting a faint smile to play upon his lips. "Regrettable timing is the least of our concerns, Mr. Thornton. The true question is whether the misfortune that has befallen Miss Merton arose from accident, oversight, or deliberate intent. Money, though persuasive, seldom commits such elaborate theatrics on its own." Thornton's expression tightened. "You would not suggest—" "Merely that the human factor must be considered at every turn," Whimsy replied, moving toward the corridor leading to the east wing. "Would you care to accompany me? The arrangement of minor details in that chamber is, I think, quite instructive." As they entered the east wing, Whimsy gestured toward the subtle disruptions he had catalogued the night before. The faint heel mark, the slant of the fallen veil, the position of the ring on its cushion. Thornton's eyes flicked to each, and a faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his unease. "Curious," Whimsy murmured, "how the slightest movement can reveal so much. Consider, for instance, this ring. It was not merely dropped, it was displaced with intent, though in a manner meant to appear accidental. And this, coupled with the scuff marks along the floorboards, suggests a presence, perhaps two, interacting in a brief but deliberate interval. Would you not agree?" Thornton swallowed, shifting his weight uncomfortably. I suppose. But surely these marks could be accidental. The house is old, the floorboards uneven. Shadows and impressions play tricks upon the eye." "Indeed," Whimsy replied lightly, though his eyes were sharp. "Yet the sequence is coherent. The scuff nearest the library door aligns perfectly with the pattern of movement one would expect if a person were seeking a particular object, one of small size, valuable, and capable of attracting attention. And, if I may add, the movement does not correspond precisely with any activity recorded by the staff. Here lies our first puzzle." The subtlety of the hint was not lost on Thornton, who adjusted his spectacles with an almost imperceptible tremor. Whimsy, with a faint smile, let the silence stretch, allowing the solicitor to digest the implications. Then, as if prompted by some inner clock, the distant clang of the garden gate being opened carried through the foggy morning air. Whimsy's gaze flicked toward the drawing-room door just in time to see a figure enter, a young man of distinctly theatrical bearing, whose expression combined both irritation and urgency. He was identified by Mrs. Weatherby, reluctantly and with a sense of foreboding, as Mr. Lionel Harcourt, a distant acquaintance of the bride, recently returned from London. "Lord Peter," he exclaimed, his voice sharp and accusatory. "I had barely arrived when I was informed of this. This outrage, I demand to know who is responsible for such disgrace." Whimsy observed the man carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the glint of impatience in his eyes, and the carefully rehearsed indignation in his voice. The theatricality was unmistakable, Yet there was something in the alignment of his arrival with the gaps in the timeline that could not be ignored. "Mr. Harcourt," Whimsy said smoothly, "you arrive at a most interesting juncture. Perhaps you will assist in clarifying the timeline. You have been away from Renfield Manor, yes?" "Yes, in London. I returned yesterday afternoon," Harcourt replied, a touch too quickly. "But I assure you I had no knowledge of any incident until I arrived." Whimsy's gaze softened just enough to allow a hint of amusement. "Ah, yes. And yet, in the mere minutes since you crossed the threshold, one cannot help but notice your attentiveness to the minor disarray, the scuff marks, the misplaced veil, the ring. Most men notice nothing, yet you, perhaps instinctively, fix upon what is relevant." Harcourt's expression hardened. Well, naturally, one notices when a young lady is in distress. One does not ignore such matters." Whimsy allowed the statement to hang, silent but pointed. Already, in the brief exchange, the first red herring had taken shape, the arrival of a man whose motive, jealousy, opportunity, or merely the need to appear concerned, was obvious, yet whose precise movements and timing required careful scrutiny. The intrigue of Renfield Manor was deepening, and the strands of suspicion were beginning to tangle. Whimsy's smile, faint and arch, revealed nothing, yet in his mind the careful tallying of discrepancies, appearances, and subtle gestures had begun. The game, as he well knew, was no longer one of idle curiosity. It was now a matter of assembling the smallest irregularities into a coherent chain from which the truth, inevitably, would emerge. And somewhere within the house, in the still shadows of the east wing, the bride's secret distress and the man's dramatic arrival were already knitting themselves into a narrative that only precise observation, patience, and logic could unravel. Whimsy allowed Mr. Harcourt a brief moment to settle, noting the restless fidgeting of his fingers and the way his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the east wing door, as though he expected, or perhaps hoped, to witness some further disturbance. It was a subtle display, the kind of involuntary behavior that revealed far more than words ever could, and Whimsy filed it carefully in his mind, alongside the timeline discrepancies he had already begun to assemble. "Mr. Harcourt," he said, adopting a tone of polite detachment, "you have recently returned from London. I should like to understand precisely the circumstances of your journey. Times, connections, anything that may seem trivial." Harcourt hesitated, perhaps weighing whether the information would serve him or incriminate him, before replying with a measured precision that betrayed effort. "I arrived on the afternoon train from Paddington, scheduled to reach Little Harrowby at 4:15. The carriage was scarcely occupied. I had a brief conversation with the station master upon arrival, and then I came straight here, having heard nothing of what has occurred." "Interesting," Whimsy murmured, noting that the time of arrival corresponded almost exactly to the interval during which the scuff marks, veil tear, and displacement of the ring could have taken place. He allowed the observation to remain unspoken, though the raised eyebrow and subtle tilt of his head suggested it was under active consideration. He moved on, with the same deliberate poise, toward Mrs. Weatherby, who had remained in the hall, hovering uneasily. "You have provided me with a clear account of movements yesterday. May I trouble you for a few additional details?" He gestured toward the corridor leading to the east wing. The precise handling of objects, the order of tasks, even the way the curtains were adjusted or the chairs arranged, these minutiae may prove crucial. Mrs. Weatherby's hands tightened around her apron, but she complied, speaking with hesitant thoroughness. She recounted the exact sequence. Tea cleared from the dining table, candles retrieved from the kitchen, the small staircase inspected for dust, the nursery left in order. Each statement, while outwardly mundane, contained subtle contradictions, slight shifts in phrasing, small variations in times, tiny lapses in certainty. Whimsy, attentive as ever, catalogued them all, knowing that they would coalesce into a pattern when aligned against other observations. He next questioned Miss Perry, gently pressing her to recall any sound, draft, or fleeting impression she may have noticed while attending the children. She initially insisted she had observed nothing, yet under Whimsy's careful, unassuming questioning, she admitted to a faint rustling near the east wing corridor, a sound she had dismissed at the time as a draft or a settling shutter. That single, otherwise negligible detail aligned perfectly with the scuff marks and the brief gap in the staff's timeline, confirming that someone, small and deliberate, had moved through the corridor unnoticed. Whimsy rose and walked slowly toward the window, staring into the foggy gardens where the footprints had been noted the day prior. The impression of careful, deliberate movement in the mud mirrored the sequence he had reconstructed indoors. He began to see the interplay between interior and exterior activity. Small intervals, unnoticed by all, yet sufficient for a person of intention to traverse the house and effect subtle change. A displaced veil, a fallen ring, a scuff mark carefully left to suggest accident. He returned to Mr. Harcourt, who now appeared slightly more agitated, his composure fraying around the edges. "You see, Mr. Harcourt," Whimsy began gently, "the question is rarely whether an event could have happened, but rather whether it did and why. We have noted marks, sounds, and movements that suggest a presence. Yet the absence of witnesses complicates matters. Pray, are there any peculiar habits of the household staff you have observed in your absence that might assist us?" Harcourt hesitated, then, with a faint flush, remarked that some servants were unusually meticulous, almost obsessively attentive to the arrangement of objects, the alignment of curtains, and the polishing of floors, a trait, he admitted, that he found both admirable and irritating. Whimsy's faint smile was private, almost imperceptible. The very thoroughness Harcourt deplored could, if misapplied, provide both cover and opportunity for subtle manipulation. As the morning progressed, Whimsy allowed the interviews and observations to proceed, interspersed with pauses in which he moved silently through the corridors, inspecting shadows, edges of rugs, the direction of dust patterns, and the tilt of furniture. Each trivial detail reinforced his growing conviction. The apparent simplicity of the incident concealed a carefully orchestrated arrangement, and someone had exploited every available gap in attention to engineer a scene that seemed accidental but was anything but. By late morning, the first outlines of a theory had begun to form in Whimsy's mind. The scuff marks, the displaced ring, the torn veil, and the silent movement through the house all pointed toward the interplay of timing, opportunity, and human psychology. Mr. Harcourt's dramatic arrival, while suggestive of concern, now warranted close scrutiny. His precise movements and his knowledge of trivial details could either implicate him or provide a deliberately misleading facade. Whimsy allowed a faint arch of the lips, a tiny flicker of amusement in the otherwise tense atmosphere. The game was becoming intricate, the threads intertwining with care. The seemingly obvious was rarely the truth, and he knew that patience, observation, and subtle questioning would be required to unravel the design hidden within Renfield Manor. And as he moved again toward the east wing, every floorboard, curtain fold, and shadowed corner seemed to whisper of secrets waiting to be revealed, each one a step closer to understanding the true sequence of events that had led to the bride's mysterious distress. Whimsy lingered in the east wing, allowing the soft light of late morning to fall across the floorboards, highlighting every irregularity, every whisper of movement left behind. He crouched briefly, examining the scuff marks anew, tracing the faint trail with his gloved fingers. It was a curious pattern, deliberate enough to suggest intent, yet faint enough to escape casual notice. He straightened and looked at the veil draped over the back of the settee, torn along a single seam, as though grasped and pulled rather than caught by accident. The ring, still resting at an angle on its cushion, seemed to mock the apparent disorder of the scene, hinting that every element had been staged to conceal something far more deliberate. A faint rustle drew his attention to the slightly ajar corridor door. Whimsy paused, listening. The quiet was broken only by the distant ticking of the drawing-room clock, each measured second a metronome for the unfolding investigation. He stepped forward, noting the alignment of the curtains, the tilt of a picture frame, the tiny abrasion along the door jamb. Every detail corroborated his initial suspicions. The room had been carefully manipulated to appear accidental, yet the sequence of movements required both knowledge and precision. Mrs. Weatherby appeared in the doorway, her hands clasped nervously before her. "My lord, I thought I would check on Miss Merton. She seems quieter now, but still pale. I have sent the children to the nursery, as you suggested." "Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby," Whimsy replied, his tone gentle yet edged with intent. "Do you recall whether anything was moved or appeared disturbed, aside from the obvious disarray?" She hesitated, frowning. "Well, now that you mention it, the silver salver in the sideboard was slightly askew. I thought perhaps I had not polished it correctly yesterday, but it struck me as unusual." Whimsy's eyes flickered toward the sideboard. A displaced salver was a minor irregularity in itself, but placed alongside the scuff marks, the fallen veil, and the ring, it suggested a momentary focus elsewhere, an interruption in the apparent sequence. He filed it carefully, noting that whoever had orchestrated the scene had either overlooked the salver or intended it as an unremarkable distraction. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself, "how trivial details often conceal more than the obvious." He rose and began to pace slowly along the corridor, his eyes tracing the faint patterns of dust and light. Every interval between the staff's activities, every movement recorded by furniture, every subtle noise reported or dismissed was being arranged in his mind like pieces of a delicate puzzle. The sound of footsteps drew his attention, and he turned to see Harcourt lingering at the far end of the hallway, attempting to appear casual, but betraying tension in the precise angle of his shoulders and the flicker of his gaze toward the east wing. Whimsy's observation was instantaneous. The man was monitoring reactions, noting the way the household moved, and doing so with an almost theatrical care. It was a performance, though whether it concealed guilt, curiosity, or some other motive remained to be determined. "Mr. Harcourt," Whimsy said softly, "you have already provided your arrival time, but there is a brief interval, approximately 5 minutes, between your entry and your initial report of the incident. Might I trouble you to explain precisely what you did in that span?" Harcourt's eyes flickered, betraying the first real sign of unease. I walked through the hall, observed the state of the corridors, ensured that the servants were informed, and then proceeded to the drawing room. Nothing more." "Indeed," Whimsy said with the faintest hint of irony. "And during that walk, did you notice anything unusual? Dust disturbed, objects misaligned, footprints, small and deliberate? Even the slightest irregularity may prove enlightening." Harcourt hesitated again, frowning. "I cannot say. Perhaps the scuff marks. I did not notice them at the time." Whimsy allowed the silence to stretch, then moved closer to the corridor door as if to inspect it anew. The alignment of the lock, the subtle abrasion of the handle, the faint pressure mark on the floor suggested that someone had paused, adjusted, or perhaps even manipulated the mechanism. Each detail was consistent with the brief, deliberate interval in which the ring had been displaced and the veil torn. He straightened, arching his head slightly, and turned his gaze upon Harcourt with measured calm. The sequence is simple, yet precise. A person moves through the corridor, interacts with the environment in a controlled manner, and leaves no sound. The interval is brief, and the evidence, though subtle, is undeniable. You will forgive me if I appear over-precise, but the truth is often revealed in such minutiae. Harcourt's flush deepened, and a subtle tightening of the jaw suggested inward calculation. Whimsy, meanwhile, allowed his eyes to drift toward the library window, still locked, and the high sill beyond. The impossible access, the careful orchestration of time, the deliberate silence, all pointed to a methodical orchestration, and he knew that the apparent innocence of the household, and even of Harcourt himself, required further scrutiny. Returning his attention to the scuff marks, the displaced ring, and the small abrasion near the door, Whimsy's mind quietly began to construct a model of the movements. Each element, no matter how trivial, had a role in the sequence, and already he was beginning to see the faint outlines of a plan. Something subtle, deliberate, and psychologically precise. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Renfield Manor, the house seemed to watch, as though it understood that its secrets were being assembled piece by piece, ready in due course to reveal the truth to a mind capable of reading them. As the morning waned, Whimsy's attention shifted to the smallest details, the ones the others dismissed as irrelevant. The faint whiff of oil near the east wing door, the tiny scratch along the windowsill in the library, the way the curtains, though properly drawn, had a subtle crease in one corner, all suggested that something, or someone, had passed through with purpose. He knelt for a closer inspection, noting a thin smear of dust along the edge of the sill that aligned perfectly with the heel mark upstairs. Mrs. Weatherby hovered nearby, wringing her hands. I cannot imagine what could have happened, my lord," she whispered. "Everything is in its place, and yet something is wrong." "Precisely," Whimsy replied softly, straightening. "It is the very appearance of order that conceals the disruption. And the disruption, as ever, is psychological as much as physical." He moved toward the library window, glancing upward at the locked latch. From below, the sill seemed entirely inaccessible, yet the faint abrasion suggested that someone had, at some point, handled it. He considered the possibilities, mapping each movement in his mind with meticulous care. Then, almost casually, he asked, "Mrs. Weatherby, do you recall whether the window had been opened recently, or whether the lock had been tampered with?" She shook her head, hesitant. "No, my lord, it has always been secure. But now that you mention it, I did notice the lock seemed a little loose yesterday. I thought it was my imagination." Whimsy's eyes flicked to the small smear of dust. That slight looseness was no coincidence. It suggested intervention at some point, however minor, that had gone unnoticed. And yet, combined with the other movements, scuff marks, displaced ring, torn veil, it implied a methodical plan rather than accident. He straightened, walking slowly back toward the corridor. "And the salver in the sideboard? Was it ever moved yesterday?" Mrs. Weatherby's hands pressed together. "Yes, my lord, but only to set the afternoon tea. I did not notice any difference at the time." "Curious," Whimsy murmured, arching an eyebrow. And yet, when combined with the other small disturbances, it is precisely these minor anomalies that reveal the true sequence of events. One might almost say, the house has been speaking to us all along, had we only listened carefully. Harcourt, standing at the far end of the corridor, shifted uneasily. "Surely, Lord Peter," he interjected, "we are chasing shadows. Miss Merton fainted. There was a bit of disorder, perhaps even some accident. There is nothing more to it." Whimsy's lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly. Perhaps. And yet shadows often conceal motives. What appears accidental may be deliberate, and what seems trivial may hold the key. Observe, for instance, the alignment of this veil and the placement of the ring. Both were intentionally altered to mislead. Both were small enough to escape casual notice. And yet they, combined with the interval of movement we have reconstructed, tell a coherent story. He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle, then moved toward the library window once more. There, the scratch along the sill and the faint dust smear suggested a hand or object had interacted with the lock, though without leaving obvious evidence. He considered the angle, the height, the distance, and realized that it aligned perfectly with the heel mark downstairs, as though the same brief interval that permitted the displacement of the ring had also included this subtle manipulation. Mrs. Weatherby's breath caught. "You mean someone deliberately staged it?" "Exactly so," Whimsy said quietly, his eyes scanning the corridor and the faint traces of movement. "The method is subtle, the timing precise, and the psychology flawless. And the true ingenuity lies in the choice of distractions. The salver, the slight looseness of the lock, the misalignment of curtains, all minor, all intended to appear accidental, yet together forming a pattern that leads inexorably to the orchestrator." He straightened, letting his gaze settle on Harcourt. "The question, of course, is whose hand executed these movements, and with what intent. Motive, opportunity, and attention to detail are not distributed indiscriminately. One observes, notes, and waits for the moment when the next small piece of evidence reveals itself. In that silence, heavy with anticipation, the east wing seemed almost to breathe, the faint dust motes dancing in the narrow shafts of sunlight, hinting at a sequence of movements, of intention, of human calculation. And as Whimsy allowed his mind to trace each possibility, he realized that the overlooked, previously dismissed details, the window, the salver, the scuff marks, were no longer irrelevant. They were the first cracks in a carefully constructed facade, and they would soon yield the narrative that had been hidden in plain sight. The game, as always, was one of patience, observation, and quiet deduction. And somewhere in the still corners of Renfield Manor, the truth awaited the subtle hand of reason to assemble it piece by piece until the final revelation became unavoidable. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy's attention turned increasingly to the subtle interplay of movement and timing that the morning's observations had begun to reveal. He moved again through the east wing, pausing to note the alignment of the furniture, the slight depression in the carpet near the settee where Miss Merton had collapsed, and the tilted curtain that caught the sunlight in a faint, revealing gleam. Each detail, he understood, was a letter in a carefully written message, one meant to mislead all casual observers while simultaneously leaving a trail for a mind attuned to pattern and deduction. Mrs. Weatherby hovered anxiously in the doorway, clutching a tea towel as if it were a shield. I do hope we are making progress, my lord," she murmured. "Indeed, Mrs. Weatherby," Whimsy replied, his tone gentle yet edged with a precision that demanded attention. "Progress is measured not by the grand gestures, but by the accumulation of the seemingly trivial. Every scuff, every tilt, every misplaced object is a word in the narrative we are reconstructing. One must attend to these whispers of evidence, for they alone will lead us to the true sequence of events." He turned his gaze toward the library window, noting once more the faint abrasion on the sill and the dust smear along the edge. It suggested a deliberate pause, a careful adjustment, yet nothing overt, an almost invisible manipulation that could have been executed only by someone with intimate knowledge of the house and its occupants. "Lord Peter," Harcourt interjected, stepping forward, "surely you do not intend to suggest that anyone among us would intentionally—" His voice trailed, faltering under Whimsy's calm scrutiny. "Ah, but that is precisely the point, Mr. Harcourt," Whimsy replied softly. "Intent is rarely as obvious as we would like to imagine. Often it is hidden beneath layers of propriety, attention to detail, and the artifice of normalcy. And yet intention leaves traces, however subtle." He moved toward the salver on the sideboard, examining it with a casual air while noting the faint displacement of dust along its edge. A deliberate object had been shifted, enough to appear accidental, yet consistent with the other minor manipulations he had observed. He catalogued the intervals mentally. The scuff marks on the floor, the shifted salver, the torn veil, the displaced ring, the dust on the library window, all formed a coherent sequence, each minute interval carefully orchestrated. Whimsy paused, considering the psychological element. Whoever had executed these movements had done so with the awareness of being unobserved, exploiting the habitual attention and distraction of the household staff. He recalled Mrs. Weatherby's meticulous movements, Miss Parry's absorbed focus on the children, and even Harcourt's theatrical arrival. Each had provided both opportunity and a convenient cover for the brief, precise intervals during which the scene had been manipulated. His eyes flicked toward the corridor, noting a narrow line of sunlight that illuminated the faint smudge along the parquet. A small heel had passed that way, no larger than a woman's, no heavier than a restrained, careful movement. He began to see the choreography, the deliberate path along the corridor, the pause at the window, the adjustment of the veil and the ring, and finally the retreat to create the appearance of sudden collapse. The subtlety was exquisite, almost theatrical, and it required both patience and attentiveness to detect. Harcourt, sensing the narrowing of attention upon the movement of the morning, shifted uneasily. "You are suggesting a deliberate act, then," he said, voice tight. "But who could have had both the knowledge and the opportunity?" Whimsy allowed a faint arch of the lips, almost imperceptible, before answering. "That, Mr. Harcourt, is precisely the question. We must examine not only opportunity, but habit, knowledge of the household, and the capacity for quiet manipulation. The answer lies in the intervals that all have overlooked, the trivial movements that no one thought to record, and the psychological tendencies that, when aligned, leave an unmistakable pattern." He paused, scanning the corridor and the east wing, and for a moment the house seemed to hold its breath with him. The faint scratches, the minute displacements, the subtle indications of deliberate passage, they formed a tableau that demanded interpretation. "And interpretation," Whimsy continued softly, "is our task. The shadows we chase are not accidental. They're composed of human intent, precise timing, and the small, deliberate manipulations of a careful hand. One may appear innocent, another concerned, and yet the pattern will not lie." As he spoke, he began to reconstruct the sequence in his mind, tracing each movement from the library window to the scuffed floor, from the displaced veil to the ring's peculiar angle, noting every gap in the timeline. The picture that emerged was both subtle and unnervingly exact. The incident had been staged, yes, but the true orchestration lay in timing, opportunity, and psychological foresight. And in that quiet, measured contemplation, Whimsy understood that the next revelation would hinge upon a single, previously overlooked detail. One small element that, when reintroduced into the narrative, would illuminate the mind behind the carefully arranged scene. Whimsy's eyes lingered on the small details as the afternoon waned. He moved deliberately through the east wing, pausing to inspect the subtle evidence that had accumulated over the morning. The faint smear of dust along the library sill, the scuff marks leading from corridor to corridor, the slight tilt of the veil, all were elements of a carefully composed scene, each designed to suggest accident while concealing intention. He crouched to examine the scuff marks more closely, noting their depth, spacing, and direction. They indicated two distinct movements, one lighter, one heavier, overlapping in a way that suggested both speed and caution. His gloved fingers traced the path gently, aligning it mentally with the displaced salver and the angle of the ring. The pattern was no longer ambiguous. It was deliberate, psychological, and precise. Mrs. Weatherby hovered in the doorway, her expression anxious. I cannot see how any of this could have happened, my lord. It seems impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Mrs. Weatherby," Whimsy replied gently, his tone soft yet incisive. "It is merely a question of observation and interpretation. The house tells its story if one knows how to read it, and every element, every tilt, scuff, and smear speaks to a human presence with intent." He straightened and glanced toward the library window, where the faint abrasion along the sill caught the last of the afternoon light. The lock remained intact, yet the mark suggested handling, deliberate and restrained. Whimsy's mind traced the sequence: a careful passage through the corridor, a pause at the window, adjustment of the veil and the ring, retreat, and a return to appearances. Each movement fit within the 5-minute interval in which the incident had occurred, perfectly timed to avoid observation by staff or guests. Harcourt, standing near the corridor, shifted nervously. "Surely, Lord Peter," he said, voice tight, "you're implying someone staged the entire episode deliberately. That seems extreme." Whimsy's eyes flicked to him, faint amusement hidden in the calm arch of his brow. "Deliberate, yes. Extreme, perhaps only in the eyes of those unaccustomed to careful orchestration. Consider, Mr. Harcourt, the displacements, the subtle scratches, the timing of movements. They reveal a hand at work far more methodical than accident would allow. The question, of course, is who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to execute such precision." He moved toward the sideboard, noting the salver once more. Its slight displacement, previously dismissed as trivial, now aligned with the scuff marks and the disturbed veil. He crouched and traced the dust line with a fingertip. This small shift, unnoticed by all, is as telling as the loudest alarm. It is the silent testimony of careful intention. Harcourt's composure faltered, a faint color rising to his cheeks. Whimsy's gaze was quiet but unrelenting, and the man's theatrical concern now seemed rehearsed, almost defensive. Yet there was no overt evidence against him, only the subtle signs of observation and reaction, which, in Whimsy's experience, often revealed as much as physical traces. Whimsy straightened and turned toward Mrs. Weatherby. "You observed the alignment of the curtains yesterday, did you not? Any irregularity in their position?" She hesitated, then admitted that one panel had been slightly creased, though she had assumed it the work of a draught. Whimsy's lips curved faintly. "Indeed, the slightest alteration in habitual order often conceals the greatest intent. Small, deliberate manipulations form the skeleton of a larger action, one that passes unnoticed until assembled in sequence." He moved slowly toward the corridor again, scanning each detail: the tilt of a picture frame, the faint indentation in the carpet, the subtle smudge on the door jamb. The pattern was clear: a brief interval, unnoticed, exploited by someone with intimate knowledge of the household's habits and movements. Each trivial anomaly, previously dismissed, was now a critical link in the chain. "The time has come," Whimsy said quietly, his eyes sweeping the corridor, "for us to consider the previously overlooked elements, the details that seemed irrelevant, but which, when reintroduced, illuminate the entire incident. One such detail will reveal the mechanism behind the apparent accident, and with it, the mind responsible." A hush fell across the east wing. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows stretching long and silent along the parquet. Whimsy allowed a faint, arch smile to touch his lips. The sequence was now visible in his mind. The brief movements, the slight alterations, the psychological orchestration of distraction. And as the last rays of sunlight faded, he knew that the next revelation would hinge upon a single, previously disregarded clue. A small, overlooked piece that, when brought into focus, would unravel the carefully staged scene and point unmistakably toward its author. The final hours of daylight filtered through the east wing windows, casting long, thin shadows across the floorboards, and Whimsy moved among them with deliberate calm, as if each shadow were a word in a sentence he was quietly reading. He paused at the library window once more, studying the faint abrasion on the sill, then the minute dust smear along its edge. The evidence, so easily dismissed by an inattentive eye, had become a silent witness to human intention. He turned to Mrs. Weatherby, who watched him with an expression of near adoration tempered by anxiety. "I cannot imagine what could reveal the truth, my lord," she murmured. "Ah, but truth," Whimsy replied softly, arching an eyebrow, is rarely dramatic in its own right. It is subtle, insistent, and requires only patient observation to emerge. It hides in the small, carefully ignored details. The tilt of a veil, the angle of a ring, the scuff of a heel. And when these details are assembled, they speak with an unmistakable voice. He moved toward the corridor, pausing to glance at Harcourt. The man's posture had stiffened. The theatrical composure of earlier hours had given way to something taut, hesitant. Whimsy, noting the slightest flicker of hesitation in Harcourt's gaze, did not speak immediately. He allowed the corridor itself, the scuff marks, the displaced furniture, the subtle dust, speak silently, giving the scene time to resonate. Then, with the faintest trace of a smile, Whimsy began to recount the sequence aloud, his voice calm, deliberate, and precise. Let us review, for clarity, the intervals of yesterday, a brief passage through the East Wing corridor, the pause at the library window, the adjustment of the veil, the tilting of the ring, the scuffing along the parquet, and the subtle displacement of the salver. Each movement, though minor and seemingly accidental, corresponds precisely with the intervals unaccounted for by the household staff and witnesses. He paused, letting the weight of the observation settle, then continued. The method is meticulous, almost theatrical, yet utterly deliberate. The hand behind these movements possesses intimate knowledge of the house, awareness of the habitual attentiveness of those present, and the foresight to orchestrate distraction while executing a carefully timed series of small, deliberate manipulations. Harcourt shifted under the quiet, unwavering gaze of Whimsy. You are implying he began, voice tight. Not necessarily, Mr. Harcourt, Whimsy replied, a faint arch of amusement in his eyes. The movements could have been executed by one of several present. What matters is the alignment of opportunity, timing, and psychological acumen. The true author of yesterday's scene relied upon these qualities and exploited both the distractions and routines of the household. Whimsy's gaze swept the corridor once more, lingering on each minor detail he had catalogued. The scuff marks, the dust smear, the slight tilt of the veil, the displaced salver. He considered the intervals of movement, reconstructing them mentally with precision. Then, almost casually, he added, "Yet one previously overlooked element, a seemingly trivial observation, reveals the final truth. The window lock slightly loosened, the faint abrasion along the sill, the dust displaced, all these indicate a hand both small and deliberate. Combine that with the intervals of 5 minutes in which the ring and veil were adjusted, and the path of movement becomes unambiguous." Harcourt's color deepened, a subtle tension tightening his features. Whimsy did not rush. He allowed the realization to build, piece by piece, the invisible chain of events assembling in silent testimony before all eyes. "Observe," he continued, gesturing to the scuff marks and dust, the choreography of yesterday. Brief, precise, deliberate, and designed to appear accidental. Only the small hand of a person intimately familiar with the household, its routines, and the attentiveness of its occupants could have executed it. The intervals of movement, the minor manipulations, the psychological anticipation, all aligned perfectly with this individual's knowledge and capabilities. A hushed pause filled the corridor. Even Mrs. Weatherby, usually quick to interject, waited. Whimsy's gaze, calm yet incisive, settled on Harcourt and the subtle inconsistencies in his earlier statements, the slight hesitations, the unnecessary details, the gestures betraying awareness of things unseen. "And now," Whimsy said quietly, almost to himself, "the carefully orchestrated facade of accident gives way to reason. The truth, hidden in plain sight among trivialities, emerges. The incident was staged, executed with meticulous timing, deliberate intent, and knowledge of human psychology. The author's identity and the precise sequence of movements is no longer conjecture. It is logically inevitable. In the fading light, the east wing held its breath, each shadow stretching long across the floorboards as if leaning closer to witness the final revelation. Whimsy, with measured calm and arch composure, allowed the truth to settle in the room, the meticulous orchestration, the subtle manipulations, the deliberate intervals. All were now clear. The game had reached its climax, and the careful mind behind the incident was about to be unmasked. Whimsy's voice, calm yet insistent, filled the east wing, carrying each carefully chosen word as though it were part of the meticulous evidence he had been assembling. "Let us consider the final intervals," he continued, pacing slowly, his eyes flicking from one subtle detail to another. The scuff marks on the floor, the angle of the fallen ring, the tear in the veil, the displacement of the salver, the faint abrasion along the library windowsill, all these elements point to deliberate intervention. Each minor action, though outwardly insignificant, was timed with precision to exploit the attentiveness and routine of the household. Harcourt shifted again, visibly uncomfortable under the steady, patient gaze. My lord, I assure you, I had nothing to do with any deliberate arrangement. I only arrived." Whimsy raised a single finger, not in accusation but in measured demonstration. "The issue is not merely presence or absence, Mr. Harcourt. It is knowledge, opportunity, and the capacity for subtle manipulation. Consider the intervals, the precise timing, and the knowledge of habits required to execute the sequence. The evidence, when assembled logically, leaves a narrow field of possible agents." He paused, letting the silence hang in the room like a held breath. Then, stepping closer to the library window, he gestured lightly toward the sill. "Observe this faint abrasion. It is not casual. It is deliberate, executed with the careful hand of someone small enough to move unnoticed, yet skilled enough to manipulate objects without detection. Combine this with the scuff marks in the corridor and the slight displacement of the salver, and the pattern of human movement becomes unambiguous." Whimsy turned to the assembled staff, his gaze steady and commanding, noting the small gestures of attention, hesitation, and concealed emotion. "One must also consider the psychological dimension. Whoever orchestrated these events understood not only the physical layout of the house, but the attention of its inhabitants. The manipulation of objects, the careful timing, the subtle creation of distractions, these required foresight and a deep understanding of human behavior." Mrs. Weatherby's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the sideboard. "But who, my lord? Who could—" Whimsy allowed the question to hang for a moment, arching an eyebrow with quiet amusement, then turned to Harcourt with a calm yet incisive intensity. "Mr. Harcourt, your arrival, timing, and knowledge of minor details, discussed earlier as trivial, align with the orchestrated interval. The seemingly accidental displacements, the manipulations, and the subtle adjustments to objects all correspond with what you could observe and, if inclined, execute in the brief period before your declaration of discovery." Harcourt's composure faltered. A flush rose to his cheeks, and his hands twitched slightly. I merely observed, my lord. I could not." Whimsy's lips curved faintly, almost archly. "Precisely. You merely observed, and in that observation, you provided yourself the opportunity. Opportunity combined with knowledge, combined with intent. One need only align these elements to see the result. The carefully orchestrated series of minor manipulations, each intended to appear accidental, leaves but a single logical explanation for the events. The presence of a mind, both calculating and patient, exploiting opportunity, timing, and human psychology." He paused, allowing the weight of deduction to settle like a tangible presence in the east wing. The scuff marks, the veil, the ring, the salver, the abrasion on the windowsill, all now spoke with the clarity of an unbroken narrative. "And so," Whimsy continued with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman revealing the final strokes of a painting, "the scene that appeared so enigmatic, so accidental, is now fully comprehensible. Each movement, each interval, each subtle gesture was part of a design. The intervals, when reassembled, leave no ambiguity. The manipulations were deliberate, executed with precision, and psychologically calculated to appear accidental. Harcourt's shoulders slumped slightly. The tension in his stance betrayed the acknowledgement of inevitability. Whimsy's gaze softened just enough to allow a flicker of finality. "The truth, Mr. Harcourt," he said, voice quiet yet exact, "is rarely hidden in the grand gesture. It resides in the minor details, in the silent choreography, in the unseen hand that shapes events unnoticed. And in this instance, the truth has been revealed not by accident, but by the methodical accumulation of subtle evidence, each piece leading inexorably to the one who had both the means and the mind to execute it." The east wing fell into near silence. Even Mrs. Weatherby seemed to comprehend the tension draining from her shoulders. Whimsy allowed a faint, arch smile to play upon his lips, the quiet satisfaction of logic and observation complete. The house, the evidence, the psychological intricacies, they had all spoken, and the truth, meticulous and inevitable, now lay bare before those who had once considered the incident inexplicable. Harcourt's voice was a strained whisper. I see it now, my lord." Whimsy inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgement of both the revelation and the inevitability of consequence. The careful orchestration, the delicate manipulation of intervals, and the psychological foresight all had led to this unambiguous, logical unveiling. The sequence was complete, and the truth, once obscured by appearances and misdirection, now stood clear in the quiet, watchful corridors of Renfield Manor. The tension in the east wing relaxed almost imperceptibly, though the air remained heavy with the weight of revelation. Harcourt's shoulders slumped fully, the theatrical veneer of composure finally dissipating into a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement of inevitability. Whimsy allowed a few moments of silence to pass, as though the house itself had paused, waiting for the final thread of consequence to unfold. "Mr. Harcourt," Whimsy said softly, his tone retaining that arch, subtle authority which could cut or console in equal measure, "it is now apparent that yesterday's disturbances, the scuff marks, the torn veil, the displaced ring, the adjusted salver, the abrasion upon the library sill, were not accidental. They were orchestrated with precision, guided by opportunity, knowledge, and psychological acuity. The sequence is coherent, unbroken, and reveals the hand behind it." Harcourt's lips pressed together. A faint shiver ran through him. I understand, my lord. It was not intended to harm, merely to manipulate, perhaps, to test, to provoke, to control perception," Whimsy supplied with gentle inevitability. "Intent is often subtle, Mr. Harcourt, hidden beneath the guise of curiosity or care. Yet in this case, the intervals, the minutiae, and the subtle choreography betray the mind behind them. Every action, however minor, contributed to a deliberate tableau designed to obscure and mislead, and the truth, once assembled, stands without ambiguity." He paused, surveying the staff. Mrs. Weatherby's hands were still trembling, Miss Parry's expression a mixture of apprehension and relief. Even the furniture seemed more familiar now, the previously mysterious arrangements of objects and shadows resolved into a coherent story. Whimsy allowed a faint smile to play upon his lips. "You see, the house itself need not speak in grand gestures. It whispers in details, and those who listen carefully need not wait for confession. The truth, as often, has been present all along." Harcourt swallowed, a faint nod acknowledging the inevitability of Whimsy's deductions. "And the bride?" he whispered, voice hesitant. Whimsy's eyes softened slightly as he considered Miss Merton, now resting in the nursery, pale but steady. "She is fortunate," he said gently, in that the orchestration of yesterday's events, though deliberate, was designed to unsettle rather than injure. Yet the psychological pressure, the subtle manipulations of expectation and timing could have been disastrous had she been less resilient. He turned his gaze to the corridors, to the faint scuff marks now illuminated by the fading light, to the tilts and abrasions that had so carefully hidden intent in plain sight. And this, he said softly, is why patience and observation are the truest instruments of discovery. The smallest details, previously overlooked, align into a complete narrative when approached with methodical attention. The house seemed quieter now, as if its secrets, momentarily disturbed, had been acknowledged and understood. Whimsy allowed himself one small arch of satisfaction. The sequence, the intervals, the psychological orchestration, all had yielded to reason. The human mind behind the stage disorder had been exposed, not through confrontation, but through the persistent logic of careful deduction. "Mr. Harcourt," Whimsy added, a final note of gentle admonition in his voice, "the orchestration of events, no matter how subtle, carries consequence. Opportunity, knowledge, and intent are powerful forces, yet they are not infallible against the patient scrutiny of observation and reason. Let yesterday serve as a reminder that the minor manipulations of detail rarely escape detection when one listens to the whispers of the environment and the intervals of human movement." Harcourt's eyes fell, acknowledging both the meticulous unmasking and the quiet, moral weight of the revelation. Whimsy allowed a soft, arch smile to linger for just a moment longer, then turned to Mrs. Weatherby and Miss Perry. "The house is restored to its natural order, and the narrative, once obscure, is now clear. Let us hope that its occupants, both human and structural, will benefit from the illumination of truth." With that, he straightened, adjusted his cufflinks with their habitual precision, and allowed a faint, classical nod toward the gathered staff. "And now, my friends," he said with that quiet, wry flourish for which he was renowned, "I take my leave, content that reason has prevailed, the puzzle has been solved, and the house, its whispers at last understood, may rest in peace." As he moved toward the doorway, the last rays of sunlight fell upon the east wing, illuminating the minor imperfections that had concealed intention and then revealed it. The story, intricate, subtle, and psychologically precise, had reached its conclusion. The house, the evidence, and the human motives had all yielded to reason, and Lord Peter Whimsy, with his characteristic blend of intellect, irony, and quiet drama, departed with the satisfaction of a puzzle elegantly and completely resolved.